Hey, how are we doing, Cedarbrook? My name is James Brown. I'm one of the pastors in this place. And if you are just tuning in with us now, I just want to personally welcome you. So glad that you are with us today. In fact, you are tuning in and dialing in on a great day because we are only in the second week of a teaching series that we have called The Empty Bucket List. And if you're not familiar with that term bucket list, it is simply a collection of goals or dreams or aspirations that an individual seeks to accomplish during their lifetime. In other words, a bucket list is simply a task list for life that's comprised of awesome stuff that you get to do or awesome experiences you get to have before you kick the bucket. So one of the items that I have run across in the list of bucket lists that I have been looking at is that individuals in their life, they want to meet that special someone or find that significant other or discover your soulmate or endgame or true love or kindred spirit. They want to find the yin to their yang or the other half or their perfect match so that they can eventually get married and live happily ever after. And I think it's so fun to watch two people participate in this process where they find one another, they fall in love, and they decide to spend the rest of their life together. And as a pastor, not only do I get to watch this drama unfold before my very eyes, many times I get to participate in it because part of my gig as a pastor is officiating weddings, and I love doing weddings. In fact, I have done a ton of them over my almost 25 years now in ministry. And all of these weddings, I've discovered one thing. In spite of all of the time, in spite of all of the money, in spite of all of the energy and attention and emotion that goes into these events, for the most part, weddings tend to be pretty awkward. Pretty awkward. As romantic and as beautiful as you want to think that these days are for these happy couples, the truth is no one is ever really that comfortable during the ceremony process. In fact, I would submit to you that maybe the most awkward moment in all of the wedding ceremony happens right near the end of it. So, for example, as the ceremony begins, they enter one by one, tears are shed. Who gives this woman away to be married? Her mother and I. The groom says, I do. The bride says, I do. Somebody reads from 1 Corinthians chapter 13, where they say, love is patient, love is kind, so on and so forth. And then, out of nowhere, the pianist starts playing The Broken Road. And it's at this point that the most awkward part of the ceremony begins to emerge. And I think this awkward moment is the lighting of the unity candle. Now, I totally get the significance of this part of the ceremony, but no one, and I repeat, no one ever thinks this part all the way through. And here's what I mean by that. The song, The Broken Road, God Bless the Broken Road, it is 3 minutes and 47 seconds long. And the longest it ever takes two lovebirds to light the unity candle is 1 minute max, which means that the bride and the groom have 2 minutes and 47 seconds to stare at each other while everyone else in the place is staring at them. Can you say, awkward? Right? It is an awkward moment. It's so incredibly awkward. And if you've been to a wedding, you've probably seen this moment live. Maybe you've even experienced it firsthand at your own wedding. The time after the couple, they light the unity candle. It's the slowest 2 minutes and 47 seconds that ever passes. And most couples, in that moment, they just stand there awkwardly staring at each other, right in each other's eyes for what seems like an eternity. But here's the deal. The marriage of wedding ceremonies and awkward moments, it's not a new thing. It's nothing new. That dynamic has been around for thousands of years now. In fact, I want to share a story with you today that Jesus told about a wedding where some super awkward stuff went down. And even though it doesn't involve God bless the broken road, it does give us some insights into the type of experiences that we need to put at the very top of our bucket list. So if you have a Bible or if you have a Bible app with you where you are right now, I would invite you to go ahead and join me in Matthew chapter 25. Matthew chapter 25. And while you're turning there, let me just give you a little bit of context for this story that we're going to be looking at today, this awkward wedding story. Because what is happening is that Jesus has started one of his sermons in Matthew chapter 24, and then that sermon goes all the way through Matthew chapter 25. And right in the middle of his sermon, Jesus tells what is called a parable, which is a simple story that teaches a spiritual truth. And Jesus used these parables and stories all the time to help people get a picture of his dream for this world. And in fact, as he traveled around, he was dropping these parables on people everywhere he went. And so for the rest of this Empty Bucket series, I want to take us through this entire chapter of Matthew 25, because in it there are 3 stories that help us determine how we best prioritize our lives. And so parable number 1 is found right at the beginning of Matthew 25, and it starts like this. Jesus says, "Then the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 bridesmaids who took their lamps and went to meet the groom." They went to meet the groom. Now, immediately we get the setting for this particular story. We get to know right out of the chute that this is a wedding. They're getting ready for a wedding, sort of. I say sort of because the typical wedding at this time in Israel is quite a bit different than the weddings and the wedding process that we experience today. Although both types of weddings today in first century Judaism were social events where everybody gets involved, where families and extended families and friends and neighbors and coworkers all gather to celebrate. It's similar in that fact. The first century Middle Eastern version of the wedding was a little bit more complicated than just that. In fact, here's how it goes. The wedding process in New Testament times had 3 elements. The first element was called the engagement period. Now, long before the scene that we just looked at in verse 1, before it took place, what would happen is that 2 fathers would get together and agree to have their son and their daughter get married to one another. Unlike most American marriages today, the couple didn't decide who they were going to marry. It was arranged by the dads, which to me sounds like a pretty good idea. In fact, I'm working on an application process right now so that when my daughter Gianna turns, 35 or 40, we can begin taking applications for her eventual wedding. No, I'm just kidding. But that was the first part of the process. Now, after that certain agreed upon time of dating had expired, the couple would enter into the second phase of this wedding process. And that second phase was called the betrothal period. Now, the betrothal period was the official part of the wedding process. And this is where you would have the actual wedding ceremony like we have today. Couples would get together with their families, with their friends. They would make commitments and vows to one another. And then at the end of that event, they would be officially married. These vows that they would make to one another during the betrothal time, they were binding. They were legally binding. So to get out of the process at this particular point required a legal divorce. Now that's the betrothal period. Now what's happening next is where things start to get interesting, because before the marriage is actually consummated, the dude takes off. He skips town. Not because he needs some space or some man time or to find himself or some freedom to figure his life out. He doesn't leave because of those reasons, but rather he leaves so that he can get his crap together. In other words, he needs to get his life in order. So he takes off so that he can go and maybe buy a house that they're going to live in. He takes off so that he can secure a job or maybe a farm where he can raise things or grow things. He has to get everything, every last detail set up in order to secure their future together. And this process would have taken right around a year. And so it's at the betrothal, the end of the betrothal period, that he would, and this is the last phase, he would return to get his bride so that they could finalize this last phase and they could finally begin their life together. And it's in this last phase, this return phase, that we pick up the story that Jesus is telling, because the bridesmaids, they show up at the bride's house right at the end of this betrothal year as it was approaching its conclusion, and they're going to be there waiting for the groom to return. And so once the groom gets back, they enter into this final week of celebration and festivities where then the wedding process is finally over. And the bridesmaids mentioned in the story, they play a very important part in that process. But unfortunately, in this story that Jesus is telling, some of these bridesmaids, they drop the ball. Or more accurately, they forget their oil. Look at verse 2 and see what it says. It says, 5 of them were foolish, and 5 of them were wise. Well, how so? Well, Jesus tells us, verse 3. He says, the 5 who were foolish, they didn't take enough olive oil for their lamps. But the other 5 were wise enough to take along extra oil. Look at verse 5. When the groom was delayed, they all became drowsy and fell asleep. Verse 6. At midnight, they were roused by the shout. Look, the groom is coming. He's returning. Come out and meet him. Look, verse 7. All the bridesmaids, they got up and they prepared their lamps. Look at 8. Then the 5 foolish ones asked the others, hey, please give us some of your oil because our lamps are going out. But the others replied, sorry, we don't have enough for all of us. Go to a shop, go into town, go to a store and buy some for yourselves. And this is where the story begins to take a turn. Look at verse 10. It says, but while they were gone to buy oil, the groom came. He returned. Then those who were ready went in with him to the marriage feast, and the door was locked. Seems a little intense, right? Verse 10 especially. It almost feels like you forget your flashlight, you don't get to play or participate in the game. I mean, seriously, it makes me wonder, can't they just share here? I mean, what's the big deal about them not bringing enough oil for their lamp? And that's a great question, because what we know from history is that these lamps were an essential part of this present particular day wedding process and processional. And the lamp that Jesus is talking about here is not exactly a lamp. The thing that he's describing is more actually like a torch that they were to carry. These torches that the bridesmaids would have would be long wooden poles, and then on the tops of the poles would be constructed a wire cage apparatus that would be attached to the top, and then inside that cage you would have some cloth soaked with oil that would then be lit to make the torch. And they would carry with them a little flask of olive oil so that they could keep the torch lit during the entirety of the wedding celebration. So essentially what is happening here with these lamps or torches is that the torch and the backup fuel was the ticket to be, or it was a symbol that you were part of the wedding party. And for these bridesmaids, pretty much your only job, the only thing you had to do was to make sure that your lamp was ready to use, to light up the night sky as the groom was returning to meet his bride. To not prepare your torch, to not have enough oil to keep it burning, would be in this day a sign of deep, deep, deep disrespect. In our day, it would be sort of like the bridesmaid deciding not to wear her bridesmaid dress, but instead shows up at the wedding with a baggy sweatshirt and yoga pants to stand up there while the wedding's going on. I mean, this is something that would never happen. It would create this incredibly awkward moment. And the bride would say, no, you don't. I mean, she would not accept this because it would be so incredibly disrespectful. I mean, this would never happen in our day. And a bridesmaid in Jesus' day would not show up to a wedding lampless or oilless because it would be equally as offensive. There was no way that you were going to get into the after party without it. But these bridesmaids didn't prepare thoroughly. They didn't have what they needed, which is why they rush off to a shop, to a store, into town, so that they could purchase some of this backup fuel. But in doing so, they end up missing their moment. In doing so, they end up missing their opportunity to be part of the wedding celebration. You see, as Jesus is telling this particular parable, this unique story, what he's doing is he's lifting up a truth for us, which is simply this, that because they failed, because the bridesmaids failed to prepare for one specific moment, they ended up missing the whole thing. Because they weren't ready, because they failed to prepare for one specific moment, the consequence was they missed the whole thing. And these bridesmaids knew what was happening. They knew that they had messed up big time, which is exactly why they do what they do in verse 11. Look at it with me. It says, later, when the other five bridesmaids returned from buying extra oil, when they returned, they stood outside. Remember, the door was locked. They stood outside calling, begging, pleading, Lord, Lord, open the door for us. Open the door for us. I mean, they know that they have messed up in this moment. And they're crying out, hoping things would change. I mean, you can almost see the tone of their voice as the emotions begin to escalate because FOMO is kicking in a major way. They are afraid that they are going to miss out on one of the most important moments, not just of the bride's life, but of their life as well. And so the party is starting, and they failed to prepare for the most important part. And now they're no longer welcome at the party. I can only assume that the bride is offended, probably embarrassed by their activities. So the groom speaks up in defense of his bride. Look at verse 12. He says, but he called back, believe me, I don't know you. I don't know you. Wow, right? I mean, this is starting to get really serious. This just got really real, right? I mean, but it's not like these bridesmaids ruined everything, right? I mean, after all, aren't weddings supposed to be awkward? Can't we just give these little girls a second chance here? I mean, they were probably off distracted making some TikTok dance videos or something, or whatever it was in Jesus' day. I mean, the backup oil was just a simple oversight on their part. This scenario doesn't seem fair at all. In fact, it comes across kind of cruel. I mean, can't these bridesmaids just be forgiven after the fact? Can't these other bridesmaids just give them something, part of their oil, so that everyone in this situation wins? I mean, what's amazing is that at the beginning of the story, it all started out so positive, but now it's turning out to be way worse than awkward. I mean, what in the world is Jesus doing when he is telling us this strange story? What is going on here? Why is he relaying this parable to us? Well, the good news for us is that he actually tells us the exact point that he is trying to make with this parable. He tells us what the whole thing, this whole story, this whole scenario is really all about. Look at it in verse 13. Jesus concludes the story. He says, "So you too must keep watch, for you do not know the day or hour of my return." Jesus says, so you too, listener, you too must keep watch. Why? For you do not know the day or hour of my return. Right? I mean, this is a parable plot twist if there ever was one. Because this story isn't really about a bride or bridesmaids. This story isn't about a groom, and it's not about torches or lamps or oil. It's not about any of that. It's not even about a wedding. The story that Jesus is telling is really supposed to be a warning. It's supposed to be a warning. Jesus wants his listeners, these first century listeners, and us as well, to know that he is going to come back someday. That's the whole point of this story about this awkward wedding. He's going to return to the earth one day, someday, and that day is going to be unknown, and it's going to be unexpected. And he doesn't want us to be unprepared for it. In fact, what's fascinating is that this isn't the first time that Jesus brings this topic of his return up. In fact, this story that we just looked at is really the fifth time that he's talked about his inevitable return to the earth, because he's really talked about it 4 times already up until this particular passage. 4 times he's brought this topic up. Matthew chapter 24, verse 36 and 42 and 44 and 50. And then again, for the 5th time in Matthew chapter 25, 13, he says, so you too must keep watch, for you do not know the day or the hour of my return. You see, it's this story that evokes so many emotions in our minds, but at the end of the day, it's really about the fact that Jesus is coming back, and nobody knows when. And he makes it crystal clear all throughout this sermon that the day is going to be unknown and unexpected. But Jesus pleads with his audience that whatever happens, that they're not unprepared for it. In other words, what he's saying to us in this story is that getting ready for his return should be at the very top of our bucket list. And so the question that I want to ask you today, is simply this. Simply this. Are you ready? Are you ready? Are you ready for his return? Are you ready for him to come back? And I ask that because the only sure way to be ready for an unexpected day is to be ready every day. So are you prepared right now? Do you have your lamp and oil awaiting and anticipating the day when you go to be with the Lord, or when the Lord comes to you? And I think it's a timely question, because if COVID has done anything to awaken us up to something, it has opened our eyes to the fact that the end of the world might be a little closer than we think. In fact, one of my favorite memes over the last, 6 or 7 months now is this one. I love this. This lady with the caption, "Me looking outside to see what chapter of Revelation we are doing today." I mean, the last 5, 6, 7 months has felt like that for me, apocalyptic on so many levels. But the truth is It doesn't take a global pandemic to push us toward preparing for whatever revelation or whatever the return of Jesus will bring. The good news is that you can do something about that right here and right now. In fact, Jesus would say that you need to do that right now. So are you ready? Are you ready? And if you're not ready, the question becomes, so how do you get ready? How do we get ready? Well, the truth is it's a lot easier than you might actually think it is. The Bible tells us that we were created for a relationship with God. The bad news is that our sin separates us from God and the relationship that He wants for us. And though people that don't embrace the forgiveness of sin that Jesus made possible through His death and His resurrection, the people that don't embrace that opportunity are the ones who will be shut out of the wedding celebration, shut out of heaven for forever. That's the bad news. The good news, on the other hand, is that Jesus doesn't want it to be that way at all. In fact, He did everything possible to make sure that it wouldn't happen for us. In fact, every day prior to His return to the earth, Jesus is the one actually attempting to gain entrance into our lives. In the book of Revelation, Jesus makes this statement. He said, "Look, I stand at the door and knock." The parable He told said that they're standing on the outside knocking, but He, prior to the end, is in front of the door of our life knocking. And He says, if you hear my voice and open the door, look at this. This is the invitation. This is why we call it good news. He said, if you hear my voice and open the door, I will come in and we will share a meal. How? As friends. As friends. Jesus is offering an invitation, and it doesn't matter what road you've been on before. It doesn't matter how broken your previous road that you have traveled has been. The invitation is for everyone, no matter where you come from. He offers it. And friends, this is the greatest invitation on the planet. I can't even imagine a better item that you could possibly put on the very top of your bucket list. Jesus is saying to you that He wants to be your friend. He wants to have a relationship with you. So, before we sign off, I just want to give you an opportunity to accept His invitation to you today. So wherever you are, wherever you're watching from, whatever you're watching on, I just want to ask you right now just to go ahead and bow your head as we talk to God for a moment. Please bow with me. Now, before we pray, I just want to say that it's not a mistake that you tuned in to this online service today. It's not by accident that you are here right now in this moment. It's not an accident because God wanted you here. He wants to meet you right here, right now, to begin a relationship with you today. He wants that for you. And if you want that as well, I want to invite you to just pray in your heart. You don't have to say it out loud, just in your heart. Jesus, I confess that I am unprepared to meet you at this moment. But I want that to change. I believe that you died for my sins. You were buried. You were raised. And you are alive today so that I can begin a new life with you. Please forgive me of my sins. I accept your forgiveness. I open the door to you. I open my life to you. Enter in and change me. Transform me. Give me your Spirit. I want to walk along with you in this life and the life to come. Jesus, I am looking forward to my journey with you. In your name I pray. Amen.